In today's video, I want to talk to you about reel gear ratios. Now, this is something that I think a lot of people are confused on, and for any new anglers out there that are buying their first either casting reel or spinning reel or any reel at all, I want to talk to you guys about what does a gear ratio actually mean. And so gear ratio is really simple. It's when you turn the handle of your reel a complete rotation, it's how much that reel spool is actually turning and how much line it's bringing in. And so when you look at a rod like what I have laying here, this is a Abu Garcia Revo STX. Now the STX comes in several different gear ratios, meaning that depending on what the gear ratio is and when I turn that reel handle, how much line it's actually going to take in. So this is actually a 6 gear ratio reel. So this is a 8-to-1 gear ratio reel, and it's going to take in 29 inches of line for every full rotation of the handle. Now I've got this same reel in an 1-to-1 gear ratio, and what that does is it's going to take up more line with every handle rotation, and when I turn the handle on my 1-to-1 gear ratio reel, it's going to bring in 43 inches of line, so almost a foot more of line per handle turn. So for each gear ratio, there's different jobs. And so when I think about like my 5 to 6 gear ratio reels, that's when I'm really thinking about moving baits. Things like what I have tied on here, the coal shad, crankbaits, bladed jigs, spinner baits, anything that I'm going to be throwing out there and cranking back, that's when I'm going to be throwing that 6 gear ratio reel. The biggest reason for that is just like with a car. If you have a really highly geared car that goes really, really fast, oftentimes you don't have as much torque. Where if you have like a truck that's a lower gear ratio with a lot of torque, it's able to pull things a lot easier. Same thing with your reels. Those lower gear ratio reels are just able to move those crankbaits, those baits that move a lot more efficiently than those higher gear ratios would. Another thing to keep in mind with the lower gear ratio reels and why I throw a 6 gear ratio reel on things like my bladed jigs, spinner baits, crankbaits, all my moving baits, is just because it helps me to slow down. You know, I can reel this reel at a pretty steady pace and I'm not bringing in as much line, and so I'm getting the most action out of that bait that I possibly can without fishing it too fast, because I can be a little bit like an ADHD squirrel sometimes and I can actually fish too fast, and so that lower gear ratio actually helps me to be able to fish those baits more effectively without overfishing them and fishing them too fast. Now when we think about our higher gear ratio reels, when we get up like 7 gear ratio, 8 gear ratio, even into 10 gear ratio, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, that's when I'm going to be throwing things that I'm either dragging on the bottom or I'm flipping and I'm pitching. Now the reason for that is because a lot of the times, like if you're flipping and pitching or you're dragging something on the bottom, a bass will actually grab that bait and start swimming towards you with it. And so you want to be able to take that line up really quick and get a good hook set into those fish. Whereas with these sorts of baits, like you're cranking, your winding baits, you're cranking that thing along, that bass hits it, and you just kind of want to load right into them. Whereas the dragging baits, they'll grab it, they'll move towards you, you want to be able to pick that line up, be able to hit them and get a good hook set into them. Now the thing about it is I mentioned earlier, those lower gear ratio reels are going to have a little bit more torque. And so I know what you're saying, Alex, why wouldn't I want the torque to be able to get them out of there? Well, the thing is with your higher gear ratio reels, oftentimes you're going to be throwing them on really big, heavy rods, and so the rod is going to be doing a lot of the work to get those fish out of there, and what you're actually doing is just using that reel to pick that line up and to keep that line tight and to keep a good hook into those fish to get them out of that cover. Unlike with your winding baits, where oftentimes you're going to be throwing them on a more parabolic rod, where that rod is doing a lot of the work to keep the fish pinned, and all you're doing is using that reel to just kind of keep steady pressure on them. And then I said 10 gear ratio reels. This is actually kind of a newer craze in the past few years of bass fishing, with our ability to actually make 10 gear ratio reels. And for me, this is actually kind of where I break my own advice, but it'll make sense why. I use a 10 gear ratio reel almost exclusively to fish things like buzz baits and ploppers. And the simple reason being is because I have to do minimal work to keep that bait on the top of the water where it's supposed to be. I can literally throw, you know, like with my Revo Rocket, I can throw that buzz bait out there and I can just reel almost like I would reel a crankbait, just super slow, super steady, and that real high gear ratio is going to pick up, I think my Rocket brings in like 56 inches of line or something. It's almost 5 feet of line with every reel handle turn, and it just keeps that bait on top and keeps it right where it needs to be. It gives it the right amount of action, makes the bait work how it's supposed to, and that's both with buzz baits and with ploppers. So if you want to see like a 10 gear ratio reel in action, click this video that's popping up right here.